Spinoza's view is that God is nature, Deus sive natura. In Brazil, we don't have a very good standardization yet for nature-based solutions. And in São Paulo, in many areas, that's not the case. So you have a huge density of population, but you don't have verticalization. Once you finish the garden is when the garden starts. How much you want to influence the local temperature and how much time you have to do that. We are seeing what is the influence of irrigation and the water in the soil for the cooling benefits of vegetation. I see a little bit of my work in research as a spiritual path for me as well.
That is Lucas Gobatti, PhD researcher at ETH Zurich and the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology, Eawag. As a trained architect, civil engineer and urban planner with a love for philosophy, the outdoors and spirituality, Lucas's journey to date has been about better understanding how we can adapt cities and their societies towards better climate regulation, environmental protection and human well-being. His work delves into the intersection of effective urban planning in the global north and south and nature-based solutions, in particular the links between water, vegetation and heat. My name is Peter Marcus Bach, and this is the Grand Challenges Podcast, a show about inspiring individuals who are stepping up to tackle the global challenges that our world is facing in their own unique ways. We reflect on the many out-of-the-box ways our guests have navigated the complexity and intricacies of the environment at the cutting edges of science, engineering, technology and design. On today's show, Lucas and I discuss how Einstein, Spinoza and Karl Marx have profoundly affected his personal worldview and how he balances science and spirituality in his day-to-day. We uncover planning challenges and the state of nature in Brazil and dive into some key results of his early work on how we can use vegetation and water to create more livable environments and avoid displacing the climate challenge. Detailed information is provided in the show notes over at petermbach.com/podcast. Thank you for joining us today and please enjoy the show. Lucas, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to diving deep into the diversity of things that you're doing. I think ever since you started doing a PhD, it's been very fascinating to learn what you've been up to, not just in your previous work, but also your own interests, what drives you, and just the whole collection of books that I see every now and then on your Instagram feed.
That's true. It's a lot of books.
Yeah.
Not that I read them 100%, but there's a lot of books I like reading a lot, yes.
Actually, I have to ask you about some tips for that because I got into reading more actively a few years ago. And I have this tendency to want to finish the books that I start, but I know you don't have to. I think if you've got enough from a book, then you can move on to the next one.
Yeah, I think that's already a nice strategy to approach books sometimes. You don't have to finish all of them, that's for sure. And there are nice books, but some of them, they don't even need to be finished. They don't even deserve to be finished, to be honest. Like some of them you just pick from the shelf and you think it's a nice book, but then the idea that's there is not so amazing. And I think people have this tendency of like, if I just put myself into this task, I have to finish it, but not necessarily, not go through it entirely.
The sunk cost fallacy maybe is at play here.
Yeah. That's true,
yeah. What's the least you've ever read of a book?
I think there was a book recently that I got from an author that I was already... the library that I bought the book was a library in Brazil that does a curation of books very well. So I kind of trust like the books that they put on display, and I just went there and just grabbed this book that seemed interesting. And then when I read a little bit more about the author, I was a bit confused. Like the background was not like made for doing what he was doing. And he also published too much.
Yeah.
So I think he had 50, 60 books on different subjects in only a few years. And I was like, should I trust someone that has so much to talk about so many things, like I was not... And in the end, like the conversation in the book was not something that I agreed about. And then I even posted on Instagram a little bit about the book and why I didn't agree about the book and then why I didn't continue. And it was nice to hear some feedback from the people like, I never imagined, that such a book would be like that and And then it was interesting. It was quite a recent thing. It's not often that I don't finish a book that I buy, but that was one of the cases. Yeah. Nice experience in the end.
I noticed you like to mark up your books. I do that too. I underline key sections. I bookmark the pages so that I can find them again. Well, usually the entire book ends up getting bookmarked, but that's just me and trying to be complete and thinking everything's important. But what's your strategy?
Yeah, I tend to highlight stuff with pencil so that, like at some point I want to sell the book again or whatever, I can erase if I need, and I have done that before. But yeah, that's what I do. And I end up highlighting some parts. And I also tend to write some stuff close to it to kind of help me go back. I know that there will be some books that I will have to go back eventually at some point. Like when I write something important about the subject, I end up just going through the books a lot and writing something, or like putting asterisks or exclamation points sometimes when it's really important, or even like doing a little folding on the page, like folding the corner of the page to understand that I have to go back there eventually. Yeah, it's something I do a lot. But I also try to not highlight too many things as well, because I know that when I go through it, it will take time.
Yeah.
And yeah, just highlight the important things and also highlight more the very important things, like with exclamation marks or something.
I guess to be selective must take a bit of guidance from you, because I feel like every book I read, the top part of the book becomes thicker than the rest of the book because of all these, these folds. I don't actually know what the English word is called. I'm just thinking of the German word now. If you translate it loosely, it's donkey ears.
Donkey ears.
Yeah, donkey ears. Eselohren, that's what they call it in German, folding the top of the page. I do that with the bottom of the page as well, if it's a really important page.
I used to do that with the top of the page. If the highlight was on the top of the page, if it was on the bottom, I just fold the bottom. But I don't do that anymore. Like that was something I did before, not to use pencils in the book.
Okay.
But now I just use pencils and I don't fold the pages so much anymore.
Interesting. Yeah. We all have quirky ways of reading and, I guess, navigating books.
Yeah.
Nice to share once in a while. But yeah, amongst the books you've read, and listeners, you can always check out his library of books on his personal website. We'll put that in the show notes. 3 names have popped up that I think have had a very important influence on you, your life, your career, and where you're heading. Mm-hmm. And I guess to highlight, you're working in nature-based solutions, particularly for urban heat mitigation, but also linking it with the role of water. Mm-hmm. How do the names Karl Marx, Baruch Spinoza, and Albert Einstein factor into this?
I think that has to do a lot with why I'm here at Eawag even. So when I started the bachelor's in civil engineering, when was that? 2012. I started the bachelor's in civil engineering at the University of São Paulo. And then I had in the first year the physics courses that we had to learn a little bit of relativity. And I was really excited about learning about relativity in general. Not that I went really well in the tests, but I enjoyed the subject. And meanwhile, I enjoyed the subject. I also enjoyed the life of Einstein at that moment, and I started reading some biographies about Einstein. And one thing that really surprised me at that time was his beliefs in, like, religious beliefs in general.
Okay.
And I remember that there is some quote on what he said at some point, that when somebody asked like what's his religious views, and he said like, I believe in Spinoza's God. And I was a bit intrigued about like, what's this Spinoza's God thing, and like what is so different about it. And then I went to read, I think it was about 18 years old, the Ethics from Spinoza, which is a really nice book. Have you read that one? No,
I haven't read it myself, but after researching for this episode and talking to you, it's definitely a book I want to pick up and have a look at. So yeah, Baruch Spinoza, or Benedictus de Spinoza, Portuguese Jewish philosopher, and he lived from 1632 to 1677. The Ethics is probably his most famous work.
I think it is, yes. I think it is. And maybe it's one of those books that you don't have to finish entirely.
Okay.
So I think it's nice to, even if you just take the time to read the first few pages, I think it's already really impressive what he does in the book. So what happens is that he demonstrates in the first proposition. So he uses this geometrical demonstration, let's say, so very logical arguments to conduct the thought of the reader. So he starts with some axioms and then propositions, corollaries. So everything derives logically from the axioms in the beginning. And then I remember that at that point, I was a really strong atheist. And then I read this book, and I think it was the 10th proposition or something, he just derives that God exists. And I couldn't like bring any arguments against it at the time.
Interesting.
And I was like, probably I need to work on the axioms or something, like on the first things but I just couldn't. I just couldn't like bring something against those arguments. And I was really impressed with that. And then later I started understanding like what is the God that he talks about. It's just a different God in relation to the God that we have in Christianity, for example. That's this transcendental being that creates the universe, and everything kind of derives from that God. And it's even like a bit of Aristotelian, is that how you say in English, from Aristotle's view that the universe is a thing in motion, and there's some entity that's movable and then just kind of puts everything in motion. This is this transcendental view of God that's kind of outside the universe. So the universe is a closed entity, and there's something that kind of sparkled it. And Spinoza's view is that God is nature, Deus sive natura. And this is more of an immanent view, right? So that God is just everything that we have around us. And I really enjoyed this view. And nowadays I consider myself a Zen Buddhist. And Zen Buddhism also has this same view, same idea of God.
It's a school of Buddhism that is based on this idea that, everything around in nature is alive, and that it embodies, I guess in Spinoza's words, the only thing that is absolutely infinite, self-cause, and eternal is substance. Something I'm trying to get my head around after reading this for only a short while. But essentially, nature, everything comes from nature and goes back to nature. I guess it's that idea.
Yeah. I think it's a pretty similar idea. I think the idea that you mentioned is also something that's really present in indigenous ontologies, that the things that we normally consider not living things, so for example, rivers, forests, I think we kind of consider them living things, but like mountains, just landscapes in general, they embody some kind of life as well for the indigenous view of life. And I also agree completely with that. I think that's the same idea. And Zen also kind of considers that a little bit the same way. So rocks would also kind of embody some form of life in general. And I think it's a pretty nice way of seeing things, because in the end, everything kind of derives from the same laws of nature, right?
Yeah.
I myself, I have no idea if I'm right or wrong, and I think that's not even the big thing in the discussion. But I think that God in itself is a lot to do with the laws of nature. So I think understanding and researching about the laws of nature and how processes come to be and how things come to be through those processes is kind of a spiritual path as well. And I see a little bit of my work in research as a spiritual path for me as well. So, for example, now doing the PhD in the same university as Einstein has done his PhD, I think, and also was a professor here or something, no? If I'm not mistaken.
As far as I understand, he did his PhD at University of Zurich. But
was that in the University of Zurich?
I attended an ETH event once, and I remember they still bicker about it, about who gets to claim Einstein. But we'll have to get the exact details of that. Yeah. But yes, Einstein was part of ETH Zurich as well, and based in Zurich. So I guess it makes sense being in the very city that Einstein spent a lot of his life in.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, it's pretty nice to kind of be close to the path of someone that I first read his biographies and kind of changed a lot my view of spirituality and nature and this kind of stuff. So it feels really nice to kind of follow a little bit of this path as well, also exploring nature and the laws of nature in the PhD. And I think this is pretty cool.
So Einstein led you then to Spinoza. Where does Karl Marx come in? Because I only know Karl Marx for probably his most famous works, the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, really his critique that human societies develop through class conflict, and capitalism produces those tensions. And the danger with that is that eventually the working class, they will develop that consciousness of their class and try to then seize power. Okay. Probably a very, very watered down version of probably the essence of, what Karl Marx's philosophy or what his writings are about. And that's sort of what I learned back in history class as well, the Communist Revolution. But what role has Karl Marx's works, and what works, in fact, have you encountered that have affected you?
So for me, while I was living the pandemics alone at home, I read the 3 tomes of Capital, and I also read it accompanied by David Harvey's book on, I don't know exactly what's the title of Harvey's book. I think it's How to Read Capital or something like that. This is just accompaniment for Capital. So you read a chapter from Capital and you read the chapter related to that in David Harvey's books. So he kind of doubles down on like the important aspect of the capital, like especially for us engineers. I think we don't come from that side of the thoughts, let's say. And so for us, it's not that simple, I think, to understand everything that the capital could bring to you. And I think it's nice to read it accompanied by a philosopher, by an economist, and this sort of expertise. And I think Harvey brings it a little bit. And Harvey, as a geographer, I think it's especially nicer to read his thoughts on Marx, because he brings this view of how does this struggles that you mentioned, so how does inequalities that we have in society, like so how we end up subdividing society in classes, how this is translated in a city, so how this gets spatially distributed in a city. So in a city we also have zones of upper classes and lower classes, and this has an effect on like how does the life of the people on these areas will eventually be. It's not deterministic, of course, but it explains a lot. So if you take the postal code of someone, it's probably a very good proxy for a lot of the stuff that this person will live. So the struggles that this person will go through, and even the amount of vegetation that this person will have available, the parks, the infrastructure that this person will have. And now, like one of the things that I'm really interested in seeing is like also how much the heat exchange with the environment that this person will go through has a lot to do with the space and the place that this person is inserted. And within Marx's thought, like there was in the beginning of his career and in Capital, for example, he was not so much taking into account some of the struggles that we see today. So, for example, the subject of his thought was just an European white man. And now there's a lot of discussion like how Marx just leaves away like women, for example, so gender issues. But also Marx didn't take so much into account the limitations of nature in the beginning of his career. There's this author, Kohei Saito, which I watched a talk recently in Köln, in Germany. He's a really, really nice philosopher. He has a book called Slow Down, and he explains a little bit how Marx's career changed and had kind of a little bit of a drift, especially like during like a bit of a midlife crisis. When he released the first tome of Capital, it was not like received by the critique as an amazing book, so it was not out there so much, so people didn't get it so much. So it took some time, especially after Engels kind of pushed a little bit more with the supporting on the writing of the next tomes of Capital. And at that time, Marx kind of directed himself a little bit more towards the natural sciences. So he was a bit more interested in understanding natural sciences, and kind of, he didn't get rid of the gender bias in his thoughts, but he kind of worked a little bit upon the natural issues and the natural limitations upon his thought. And Saito, Kohei Saito, is the Japanese philosopher from the University of Tokyo. He discusses a little bit on this. So how this late Marx could help us right now to kind of deal with some of the climate issues that we have and like some of the main struggles that we face right now. And for me, this is like a lot of where my thoughts are going today, like kind of trying to understand a little bit of this late Marx work and the contemporary thinkers, philosophers that kind of brings this into the technical realms that us engineers could use a little bit more. So one nice example to wrap up this thing. So Saito talks about this displacement. So he brings 3 different displacements: temporal displacement, spatial displacement, and technological displacement.
Okay.
And the spatial displacement is a little bit about what Harvey have been working on. So how do we kind of create segregation within the cities? How do we kind of push aside some of the struggles that we live? So how some of the environmental costs of the stuff that we do, we push to the global south countries, for example, or we push to the outskirts of the cities, for example. So kind of the peripheries of the capital, let's say. Also the temporal drifts, this displacement, also a little bit in the idea of like how those generations right now kind of use up a lot of the natural resources that we have and kind of displace the dealing with this
to the future.
The future generations, exactly. And in the technological displacement, it's also pretty interesting. So how do we use technology to also displace and push aside the stuff that we have to deal with today? So, for example, air conditioning, I think, could be called a technological displacement in terms of heat, for example. So we kind of use technology to kind of push aside a little bit the heat problem within upper class constructions and architecture, But this have a cost. So if you use so many heat machines in the city, you will end up producing heat because there's always a loss in the process.
That third one was quite interesting. I wasn't sure what you meant by technological displacement because I've heard of spatial and temporal, but I guess that example of the air conditioners in particular relation to the core of your work, I think is very clear to really illustrate that.
I think so too, yeah. Or for example, maybe electric cars, I think, could also be considered kind of a technological, because in a sense we are investing in some technology on something that's of course better than fossil fuels, but still we're not dealing with the problem, which would be like creating more public transportation and like kind of getting rid of the dependency on private transportation, for example. So
or walkable cities.
Exactly. Yeah. So cities that, you have just commerce and job opportunities close to the places that you live, so you don't have to just think about so much on electric cars or something like that. It's important, of course. Air conditioning also is important. Like there are some situations that we really need it, but it can be used as a way of like putting the dirt under the carpet a little bit as well. So it's just awareness on like how to use the technology, I think, is important.
A very provocative thought, but also plays into spatial and temporal, because any kind of technology mass rollout doesn't necessarily mean that we're providing equality or equitable access to the benefits. It can lead to further segregation or further issues that we're seeing, especially now in the field of nature-based solutions or green infrastructure across our cities.
Yeah,
so
I agree. Yeah.
Massive planning challenge, if you want to call it that.
I agree. Yeah, completely. Yeah.
And that, in a way, has shaped a lot of your thinking around the research, which has actually been a lot more technical rather than philosophical. But I think it's nice to always bring that philosophical lens to what you do, especially in science. You started off in Sao Paulo, and you actually worked on not heat at first, but I guess heat was sort of semi-related, but the initial work you did was actually on simulation of applied mathematics and agent-based models. Like, okay, that's enlighten me a bit, because that's very interesting. Very interesting way to enter the research world.
Yeah. I think that was in Brazil. We used to have those little bachelor research projects, which are really interesting. So the students used to get a little scholarship to develop those projects and work with the professors as supervisors on some topic. So the bachelor's in Brazil is quite long, right? It's a 5-year thing. So pretty nice that the students have the opportunity to do a little bit of research during that time. And I was really interested into this numerical calculus course that I had in the engineering. I think it was a second year course or something.
Influenced by your work with Einstein and your exposure to Einstein?
A little bit, yeah. A little bit, yeah, that's true. And then I found this professor in the applied mathematics department that he used actually mathematics to describe human behavior. I think he was the only professor that kind of had a little bit of a mixture between like humanities and exact sciences that I really appreciate, that I really enjoy. And then I got in touch with him and he said like, we have this project about using computational models to describe the evolution of altruism in hunter-gatherer populations. And I was really interested in developing that project, and it was Python code and using agent-based simulation and a bit of game theory as well to like just see why this altruism develops in society. Because if you think about it, it's a bit weird to think how does that develop? Because, for example, if you have a little community of animals that one of the animals is kind of the outpost, let's say, let's just see if there's any predator coming. So if that is a kind of a DNA trait, like a genetic trait, the animal is a bit more prone to dying because it's just like more exposed to the predators and will let the others know before. So why does that develop? Like how does that continue in the other generations if that trait in that animal is just more prone for dying? And the answer to that, we ended up seeing, not in my research, but in the field in general, that's a bit explained by the community. So although there's a big cost to that one animal that kind of lets the others know that there's a predator coming, for the community, there's a huge benefit. So if you sum up the little benefits that everyone gets from that behavior, that kind of explains a little bit why does that kind of sums to something positive, And yeah, I think that was a pretty cool little research. And I think that was kind of put me in the, just first touches upon like what does scientific research look like, and made me want to kind of continue in the field of research at least.
Yeah. And then you went from there, looking at microsimulations of hunter-gatherer societies and altruism, to green roofs and stormwater.
Yes. There was a bit of a gap between that research and then what I did in the master's. So in between that research and the master's, I did this double bachelor's in the architecture school of the University of São Paulo. So they have this double bachelor's between civil engineering and architecture and urban planning. So you kind of do a little bit of everything. Which takes a lot of time. It takes 7 years for you to do, but I think you get really well that big picture. And I think all of those thoughts that I have on like philosophy and humanities, vulnerability, and the social aspect in general, I think I got a lot from the architecture studies. So within architecture and urban planning in general, that is really a thing that is discussed. So they really bring that discussion up. People are kind of up to date to this kind of topics. Within engineering, not so much. Unless you really work with vulnerability and populations experiencing vulnerability, then you know a little bit more and you're a bit more into that. But it's not so much within the discussion, I feel, in engineering. So there was a bit of a gap there on studies. And then I decided to do this master's at the Polytechnic School, which is where I did the bachelor's also, has a professional master. So you can work outside and have your own company or have work for someone while you do the master's at the end of the day, at the evening. And I did that. So I had a little company on gardening in Brazil. So I did indoor gardens and also implemented some nature-based solutions in the city, which was kind of the moment that I kind of got in touch with this a little bit more. So with bioretentions and this sort of structures. And in the master's, I studied green roofs. Yeah. So I spent those 2 years kind of learning a little bit more about plants for the first time because of the gardening and also because of the green roof masters. And in the masters, what I did was I studied the hydrological performance of green roofs that I think here in Europe, I think it's already kind of a little bit better known and quantified. But in Brazil, it's not so well quantified yet. So we still need to do some work on like seeing like if those structures work well for subtropical, tropical climates or temperate climates. Brazil has a wide range of climates as well.
Are there a lot of green roofs in place in Brazil? Is it a popular practice?
Not that much yet. I hope it becomes a little bit more of a practice because it's useful in general. It's just like a thermal inertia thing, and also can collect a little bit of the water as we saw. But it's not something common as is in Zurich, for example. Zurich, you see a lot of green roofs. It's already a thing, and already here you also see like some very wild green roofs, which is really nice. So the green roofs you see in Brazil, they're one of those. If they exist, they are just monocultural, lots of poisons to, take out the weeds and this kind of stuff. It's not yet in that level.
Very, I guess, clinically done mass rollout.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I would see that way as well, yeah.
What's Brazil's general trajectory towards nature-based solutions? Are they tracking well? Are they quite active in this field?
There is some activity, yes. Many colleagues are working towards that direction on implementing green roofs, bioretentions. We call them rain gardens mostly in Brazil. What I feel that's missing the most, there were some public policies lately, for example, in São Paulo, implementing some rain gardens in the city. And I was very happy to see that happening. And just the simple fact that you just daylight some earth back and just take out some concrete and just put some garden is already nice. But there were many problems involved into this practice. So one of them, for example, is just the lack of standardization. So in Brazil, we don't have a very good standardization yet for nature-based solutions. And I think this needs to be worked for yesterday, kind of, because São Paulo hired the implementation of these rain gardens, but you can see that they're not made properly. They're not managing water so well. Species choice was not the best as well. So there could be some work on there. And also a sad thing also is that most of these rain gardens that were built in some areas of the city center. So the city center of São Paulo is going through a huge inequality and there's a lot of people just living in the streets. And in these gardens, they were kind of used in a way of like just getting rid of spaces that people were just using to spend the night, for example, So there's also a bit of a social aspect involved, not only a technical aspect in the sense of if they're not managing water so well, like if they're not creating the best habitat for species, but also there's a social issue on like how they're being implemented. Overall, I think it's nice that's being done, but I think we can do better. And I think standardization for me is the thing that the need should be there, because then you can kind of judge, you can check if it was done properly. So you have the means, like you have the checklist to see like if the contractor did the job that it was supposed to do, you know?
Yeah. I guess standardization is one thing, but bringing back in the spatial displacement that you've hinted at now, there's also the need for strategy, which I know is one of the topics we'll get into quite shortly.
Yes.
But nevertheless, very interesting to see what the insights are in Brazil. It's been 14 years since I last stepped foot in Brazil. I was in Rio de Janeiro and Porto Alegre.
Nice.
Very, very fascinating. And I remember, the social divides are quite real. I remember taking a trip into one of the favelas in Rio, and it was just fascinating to see the way of life. I remember drinking a caipirinha with one of the locals there. It was a really nice experience and really eye-opening. So definitely a lot of challenges there that you wouldn't face in other places. And, I think we see this in Latin America in general. We heard the story from Marcus Vogel on episode 23, who told us of the situation in Buenos Aires. So I guess a very different planning landscape there that also requires different strategies to tackle as well.
Yeah. I think one of the big difference, for example, so we've done recently a work with the architecture department here at ETH that we took some students to São Paulo to experience some of the life there in the city, not only in the favelas and in the outskirts of the city, but also in the city center, and they got to see a little bit of everything. When I was there with them, like one of the things that I was kind of interested in seeing is like how the planning of vegetation in areas of high social vulnerability and high irregularity in the urban fabric will go about. So for Zurich here, we could think about like planning the planting of new trees. So we kind of have space for that. So it's there. But how do you do that in a favela? And like there's just no space. And if there is space, people will prefer to just use that space up for living than to just add a tree. And also, for example, there are huge social aspects and cultural aspects on that as well. So for example, in a favela, or just in general, in São Paulo, for example, probably in Rio the same, and other cities in the global south also the same. It's not, let's say, a white flag to add vegetation. It's not something that everybody would agree on, because in many of those areas, like you don't have very good public lighting, public illumination. And if you just create a new square with some trees, it's just going to become a dark area at night and just become a spot for drug dealing and this kind of stuff, So I think in this moment, those participatory plannings and involving the population in understanding like what is the need there locally, I think is really important. And not just bringing ideas of like doing rain gardens, new urban trees or green roofs. Every place will have its own little way of doing things. And it's important to have this dialogue with people that live there as well.
I guess it's what are the needs? What are the priorities? What are the necessities that maybe the population doesn't realize that they do need? And then I guess figuring out the space for it. And with space constraints, particularly in Sao Paulo, which is incredibly dense. I mean, just some stats. If you think it's, the urban center is like 11,000 square kilometers, the metro area around 8,000. I mean, the greater Sao Paulo, much larger municipalities, even bigger. But you've got about 7,500, 8,000 people per square kilometer, and around 21 million people in the greater Sao Paulo area. It's the biggest city in Latin America, and perhaps the densest and also, I guess, the most diverse in urban fabric because of all the different formal and informal planning that has taken place. So definitely a huge challenge. Space, definitely a bigger challenge. How do you navigate that?
And also this density that you mentioned, I think is a really interesting aspect, because sometimes we associate density with density of population with verticalization, for example, right? And in São Paulo, in many areas, that's not the case. So for example, where we took the students to visit in Brasilandia, so this is an area on the outskirts of the city, further north, that's kind of touching an area of preservation with some vegetation. So there's a big conflict between the urban fabric and the existing green space that's kind of well kept for now. But there is always a bit of a spatial struggle there as well. But there, for example, you have a huge density of population, but you don't have verticalization. Just because you have lots of people just sharing the same room, so you have 15 people living in the same house, or 8 to 10 people just sharing a bedroom, or this kind of stuff. So you have a lot of density, but you don't have verticalization. So Sao Paulo is a pretty complex situation. So in the PhD, I really wanted to take into account Sao Paulo and do the research about Sao Paulo. But I think for me, it was a bit of a down-to-earth decision on like just starting with Zurich, which is complex as well. Maybe even much more complex than I can imagine it is, because I'm not from here, so I don't see like the deep of the city as it is. But Sao Paulo, I know a little bit more, and I know that it's just so crazy complex that I was like, I wouldn't be able to just do what I'm doing for Zurich in Sao Paulo. So probably I would have to choose one particular area with some sort of homogeneous characteristics to do what I'm attempting to do with Zurich, you know.
And you offer two paths that, you want to talk at the same time, but I guess let's do one at a time, and perhaps providing some context to the listeners around maybe the technical aspects around heat mitigation and some of the key findings that you have found so far in the course of your PhD. And so we'll then revisit Brasilandia after.
Nice.
And so heat controlling a lot of human emotions, human lifestyle, health, well-being, just generally everything, and having also effects on the urban environment, how it functions, the need for technological displacement or not. You began your research in depth into heat by looking at a very simple relationship, which is we have nature-based solutions, we can plan them to help mitigate heat, but of course anything with planning involves time. How long does it take once you put in a system, once you establish the green infrastructure, for it to actually show an actual benefit?
Yeah, so this was what we did in my first part of the PhD, so this first paper. And it was a pretty interesting work, so we used a little bit of satellite imagery to see like how long does it take to reach full cooling in those areas. So we took some case studies in Zurich, and we learned that areas with trees or like bigger plants, they would take a longer time as we kind of expected, but it was nice to quantify this time. Like we kind of know those things qualitatively in general, but quantification is really important in engineering, right? So we quantified this to be around 7 to 10 years for some of those case studies in Zurich. And for grasses or shrubs, so like lower vegetation, that's a bit faster. So 2 to 3 years or something like that. But also you gain much more heat mitigation effects from those trees because they have shade, they have other tools than the low vegetation, but it just takes longer. So in the end, I think for planning this kind of infrastructure, there's a bit of a balance that you have to solve. Like, so how much you want to influence the local temperature and how much time you have to do that. So I think for areas where the population is experiencing higher heat vulnerability, for example, probably you want to have quicker interventions that you just add. Maybe you just daylight, you just open concrete a little bit and just put grasses and shrubs just to create a bit of a cool island. And then maybe in another moment, like another phase of the construction, you add other things so that that population can still experience a little bit more of a cool island in some of those spots. So I think that was a pretty interesting work. We didn't know so much work done on the temporal aspect of those blue-green infrastructure. In terms of vegetation greenery, we knew that it took a lot of time so that vegetation could develop, so that a tree could mature, and also people from ecology, for example, know very well, I think, the habitat for species creation and how much time is important for all of that thing. But I think what was interesting on the work that we did was to show that we don't have to wait all that long to reach kind of a cooling plateau where the vegetation kind of plateaus its effect, but this time exists and we have to take this into account. So if you want to do some intervention in the city to kind of create a cool island, this has to be acted and done as soon as possible because it will take time. It's just not a matter of like, I think one of the things, I don't know if it was a professor that I had or if it was Max, there was a landscape designer, really famous in Brazil, that he or this professor that worked with him says that once you do a garden, like once you finish the garden is when the garden starts. And that's the same with the blue-green infrastructure, BGI, right? So you finish a BGI, you just kind of sparkled the thing to keep going, and it will take time for this to kind of bring everything that it has that you would be expecting, let's say.
7 to 10 years for trees. I mean, it's long, but at the same time, when you think planning horizons, it sort of aligns, but it is a reality we have to deal with. And this study, you use satellite imagery, and It's, with the ubiquity of data nowadays, we have so much data available that it allows us to start looking into these things. I mean, you can listen to episode 35 with Yannick Bach, who illustrates this in a bit more detail. I mean, trees take time. And if you can manage to establish the tree over 7 to 10 years, you gain a lot of cooling benefits. I mean, on the podcast, we've spoken about temperature differences beneath shades and, in areas with trees and forests, and just the ecological nature of forests as well across different episodes of the show. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of promise there, but it is a long time. And I guess with the urgency of climate change, with the complexities of planning, the question begs to ask, do we have that time?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree completely. I think it's important to take into account the urgency of things and how some populations will need intervention quick and other populations may be able to wait a little bit more or have it's just a different way of planning.
Yeah. But I guess one very interesting aspect of this work, which in a way feeds into the next part, and it's the part you're tackling now in your PhD research, is the role of irrigation and the interaction with water. Could you tell me a bit more about that relationship?
Yes. So I think that has a lot to do with the institute that we are right now. So researching about water, I think, is a really big thing within dealing with heat. Water is really a tool that we have to be able to tackle this challenge, I think. And in this second part of the PhD, which I am right now, we are seeing what is the influence of irrigation and the water in the soil for the cooling benefits of vegetation. So we found, not to give too many spoilers on the paper that's coming out soon, I hope, we found that soil moisture content does play a huge role, a bit more than I expected, reading the literature from before as well. We know already that, for example, shade from the trees will account for around 80% of the cooling, whereas the evaporative cooling provided by the tree will float around 20%. So those were the numbers that we knew from the literature before. When we varied the soil moisture content, so when we brought not only this difference in the soil content on the soil, but also the direct evaporation from the soil, that number changed a little bit. So that could go to 60-something to 40-something%. So evaporative cooling, if we take into account not only the cooling from the transpiration of the tree, but also from the direct evaporation from the soil, played a huge role. So a role a little bit higher than we were expecting before. So that kind of hints the fact that probably we could have different ways of approaching those public infrastructures. Of course, if we think about water management, so flood mitigation, for example, we want to leave empty pores on those infrastructures so that they kind of collect, retain, or detain that water so they can collect or just delay a little bit of that water and diminish the possible effects of rainfall. But if we take into account heat mitigation, then we want to do something else. So we want to fill those pores with water so that the soil is evaporating. And you also want to leave some soil open so that the soil can breathe. And you can create a bit of a cool island under that tree. So a person would be able to shelter under the tree with the effect of shade, with the effect of evaporative cooling. So that kind of also hints a little bit to the need, possibly to some smart management of those infrastructures. So probably in the summer, ideally, we could irrigate some of the trees to create kind of a short-term urban heat cooling effect, or a short-term passive cooling shelter, for example. But maybe for the moments that you expect some rain to come, well, the rain will fill the pores anyway, so you don't have to spend water with irrigation. But you also want to leave those pores empty so that it retains that water. So I think it's a matter of planning strategy and maintenance in the end. So the maintenance is something that we're not very good in Brazil. I think Zurich's a bit better than us on that. But I think it's a huge aspect how we manage those areas, not just a matter of creating, but when you create, it's just a starting point. Then you have to manage it and you have to know how to use that thing. And water and how you cut down or manage the vegetation is also important. So management in general, I think it's really important. Yeah.
And aren't we glad that, floods and heat waves are often on opposite ends of the temporal spectrum and that they don't happen simultaneously?
Yeah, exactly.
I think if we reach that point, then we're going to have to overhaul our entire nature-based solutions toolbox.
Yeah, exactly. That would be difficult, yes.
Yeah. And in a way, this is something that you experimented with using a very well-known model. It's actually a very detailed model using computational fluid dynamics.
Yeah. This part we used EnviMat, so it's a microclimate model. It's a computational fluid dynamics based model, so it's a simplification of that so that it can be run in personal computers, and architects in general really enjoy EnviMet because it's also very friendly to use. And also the decision on using that was also so that it's a tool that practitioners in general can use. So you don't need so much prior knowledge as some other computational fluid dynamics softwares will ask you to have, because most of those softwares, they will output something, but it can not be exactly correct, the output. So you really need a lot of prior knowledge to be able to judge the output as well. So it's kind of easy to run those things, but it's a bit difficult to judge if you put the right inputs in that black box and if the output kind of makes sense, right?
I remember the first experience you had with EnviMet and trying to put the right inputs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In this work, we put some inputs, and there was a bug in the program. And what was that happened? I think the tree without any water was performing better than the tree with a lot of irrigation. And yeah, it took me a while to find out where was the error, like where was the bug. And yeah, that's one of the examples, right? So it's easy to kind of just get the wrong outputs, and if you don't have the sense to judge, you just kind of accept, and like that just becomes the truth. And yeah,
I think you didn't realize that you actually had to put soil underneath the tree.
Yeah, exactly.
To begin with.
That was the thing. Yeah, that was the thing. I just added the tree without the soil. Yeah, that was the thing. And then it just recognized that it was just like a dry or some. The tree was not working, kind of. And then yeah, it was funny,
modeling.
Yeah.
It's always a new challenge when you touch a new software. How detailed have they thought it through?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Some of the things you just assume. I guess my own modeling portfolio, I've worked with fairly conceptual models, and a lot of these things are assumed. So it was also a very funny story to me when I first saw your thermal improvements of 0.0001 degree, which, or something around that level.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But nevertheless, technical insights from the modeling, from the satellite imagery, allows you to make better judgments about how different processes of cooling are utilized best in green infrastructure.
Yeah.
And armed with this knowledge now, you're taking it into Sao Paulo, into the Brasilandia district, which, for context, has lost 60% of its greenery over the past, I'm trying to think, 10-ish years of development, or even longer.
A little bit longer, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And now are trying to restore that, to create better thermal environments, and also which hopefully would lead into better uses of green spaces and less misuse of green spaces, such as the example of no lighting that you mentioned that can lead to, I guess, illegal activities as a result of that. So where are we at with that project?
Yeah, so I think this is really in the beginning. Ideally, what we've done here for Zurich, the next step would be to do also for Brasilandia. If that happens, I think would be really amazing. I think that brings a little bit the discussion on like how does the approach for nature-based solutions can be different, especially in the struggle between the global north and the global south. I think in many areas in Brazil, for example, we have a lot of still preserved green areas. So for me, it's always a bit of a thought and a doubt as well. Like, I don't know so much how to approach that. I think it's really a local decision. How much resource, time, or investment we put into just upkeeping the things that we have, the vegetation that we have, and how much effort do we put into creating new green areas. I think Brasilandia is a really interesting example because it has the Cantareira forest. So it's a forest in a hill close by that ideally we should preserve, right? We shouldn't let the urban sprawl in that forest. And of course, there's tension on like a social tension that people just need a place to live, and they will occupy those areas. They will occupy areas where you have water sources. They will occupy areas where you have just primitive vegetation. And that's just because that's what's needed. So we need public policies to kind of contain the urban sprawl on one hand. And ideally, we also need public policies to kind of bring back greenery to the middle of the neighborhoods where you just don't have greenery anymore. And for me, it's difficult. Like I don't know. I don't have a solution for that. I think every place will have a different analysis and a different understanding of what we should do. But I think this is one of the tensions that we face a lot in areas where you still have vegetation, but you also have areas very close by that are a bit of a gray desert that you also don't have any vegetation. So.
And is heat the main focus? Or are you hoping that you will expand that to many other benefits that nature-based solutions can provide?
Yeah, so heat will be the main focus. I think it's just, the idea is also to simulate other cities now. So we did to Zurich. We will take into account other urban configurations in other climate zones, so other Copenhagen climate zones. Brasilandia ideally will be one of those areas because we already have some data about it. We managed to attach a weather station with the support of Perifo Sustentável Institute, so Sustainable Periphery, like a direct translation institute. And we have some data there. So the idea is to take into account heat, which will already be a lot of work. So probably we won't get into the realms of the other ecosystem services of habitats for species, but for sure a little bit of the water services as well. So could discuss a little bit on flood mitigation, but mostly if we touch upon water, will also be related to heat. So PhD that I'm doing now is really the intersection between the two things, water and heat. How does water allow you to manage heat better, and what is the heat influence on people?
And it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds in the coming years and what the outcomes could look like. And I guess when you start with one ecosystem service, it's only natural then when green infrastructure or nature-based solutions are involved that you will progress to the others with time.
Yeah, that's for sure. I would be very curious on seeing that, and also very curious about the results for this work as well. I'm very curious to see how the future will look like with this research.
Just don't forget to put the salt under your tree when you use the ENVIMIT model again.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially for Sao Paulo. And so where are you heading to next?
Yeah, so the next bits of work will be on the vulnerability. So we did the work on the physical modeling on Zurich. So what are the main physical processes involved, and what is the effect of adding trees and seeing the effect of soil moisture content on that. And the next steps are to take into account vulnerability. So taking into account the social aspects. So where are the people that are most exposed to heat, the people that are more vulnerable to heat in general, where are the most sensible populations to heat, the ones that will be more affected by those phenomena, and mapping that spatially. So in the end, what we want to reach in the PhD is a planning tool that gives practitioners an idea on where to put the next tree, let's say. So taking into account where that tree or that vegetated area will behave the best in terms of heat mitigation. So places where you have naturally more water, more runoff that you could already use, or reuse water close by, and the places where people need it the most. So maybe where you have the most water is not the place that the people will need that tree the most. So ideally, we take both into account, find a balance, score it spatially, and then we find a place to put the next tree. Put simply, but probably it's not going to be that simple.
And then we'll make sure that everyone plants a tree yesterday.
Yeah, exactly.
The title of a very nice short that you did on some of your work, which I think has been nominated for one of Nature's video awards or video, what do we call it?
The Science in Shorts from Nature, yeah.
The Science in Short Form.
Nature Portfolio's YouTube channel now. Yeah.
The Science in Short Form Nature on the YouTube channel. We'll definitely post a link because I think that also highlights your creativity and the passion with which you bring to your work. I guess also influenced by a lot of the philosophies we've discussed today. And Lucas, it's been a fascinating discussion so far. And like I do with every guest, I'd love to get into more deeper questions so that we can learn even more about you. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of ingredients that come together in the work that you do. And when we think of research and when we think of changing the world, we think of the word innovation. And so in your view, what does the word innovation truly mean to you, and how has it shaped the way you approach challenges or opportunities in your work?
I think I learned a bit more about the innovation aspect when I started doing the PhD, right? Because the PhD, we have to come up with something new, no? Than nobody done before, and we have to justify why that thing's new and why is that relevant for us to research and put 4 years of our life in the topic. I think for me, innovation is really related to art. And when I heard that question, I was thinking about this lecture that I had in the architecture school on art history. And then the professor there, he asked everyone, like we were first year students in the architecture course, and you have history of art 1. And he asked us, what is art? And I didn't know how to answer. And I think everybody has a bit of a different answer to that. Probably other professors will have different answers than him. But he answered that art for him is the locomotive of society. So it's the thing that kind of pushes society through.
Interesting.
And I think that means us in the technology realms as engineers, I think we have a lot to learn from art and from the innovation that artists bring. And I think it was really nice to see that coming from a history of art class, because I think personally that innovation is really related to history. And I think people that innovate really well, I think they are very good students of the past. I reckon that there is very difficult to do something really, really new. And I think everything that we do new is a bit of an adaptation of what happened in the past, kind of recontextualized to today. So I think that innovating well is knowing well the past, but also knowing well the present and the struggles that we live in the present, so you can adapt those ideas or those processes to an object, to something that will be used today.
Very fascinating. And I guess it's standing on the shoulder of giants.
Yes.
Not necessarily reinventing the wheel, but taking the wheel and making it rounder per se.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. See, like if the wheel today needs a different material, like what is available around. Yeah, this kind of stuff. I think. Yeah.
No, very interesting. Was there a key moment, book, event, person that completely changed the course of your career or mindset?
I think that would be, I think that would be the moment that I went to the Amazon forest to do a documental photography project.
You do like your photography.
I really like photography, yes. That's in my website. If somebody wants to see it, there's a page on that specific documental project. I had 1 month of vacation when I was in college and I really liked photography. So I started reaching out to people about interesting places to see and interesting stories to tell. And then I found out this community that a friend knew about in the Marajó Island in Pará. It's a state of Brazil. So it's in the oriental part of the Amazon. And it was a really interesting community. So it's a community that we call ribeirinhos, so people that live in the margins of the river.
Okay.
So really special kind of architecture, like with those foundations that are a bit prominent from the ground, and really living in the intersection between the water and the land. And I lived there with them for 1 month. They were really, they hosted really well. So they were really warm people. And that changed me a lot, like how I approached life, I think. So it was a really special moment. And just seeing people living in a different way that I was used to, like coming from a big city, right, was really impressive. So the time scale for them was different. The spatial scale for them was different. So the conversation, I remember that when I arrived there, I was a bit of just an awkward external person arriving, And I remember that everybody in the community was there to welcome me. So it was 15 people waiting for me to arrive in the community. And we sat down together to talk. And I was still kind of having that speed of someone from the big city, just kind of filling the gaps whenever somebody stopped talking, just not letting the conversation fall. And they had a different speed. So through time, through the weeks, I kind of learned to just give those silences a little bit more space. And then I got to be able to communicate and listen much better. And it was a really nice experience in general. I think it really changed the way that I approached life. I returned that after a while to bring the photos printed. So I took lots of photos. They took me to many nice places to see. Then I came back to São Paulo, printed the photos, and went back there to give back the photos of people that I had photographed.
That's lovely.
Yeah, it was really nice. And lately, some months ago, I kind of revisited that experience, seeing what changed in their way of living that I could learn and could use in the PhD as well. How they dealt with heat, how they dealt with water, because they have a lot of heat, right? And they have a lot of water.
Yep.
And that's the worst possible scenario for thermal comfort, right? Because you have a huge air temperature and you also cannot sweat because the relative humidity is super high. You sweat, but the sweat doesn't evaporate. So nowadays, I think there's a lot for us to learn with those populations that live in those areas to kind of understand how to mitigate, but especially how to adapt to heat in many situations. So I kind of looked back in that experience and I made a page in my website. So if anybody wants to see it, but that completely changed how I saw life afterwards. And then And that was after that I started thinking about a master's in plant-related stuff and started working with gardening, started being closer to plants a little bit more. So it was, I think that's the answer. That was the experience. Yeah.
A really core moment and key event that I guess also brings back a theme that you mentioned much earlier. Kohei Saito's commentary on Marx being slow, this idea of, we strive for slow cities, the slow food movement, the word slow, slow productivity as well. Recent book I read, very nice. And just this idea of being comfortable in silence, being comfortable in not the hustle and bustle, but I guess just the gradual progression.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it. I think most of the struggles that I live nowadays and the struggles that we as a society live that kind of have an influence on us, as Marx would call it, dialectical materialism, like the communication that we have with our environment and the direct affection and how we are affected by the environment that is around us. So I think there's a lot of our psychological stuff that we go through that has a lot to do with the society that we live in and the environment that we are situated. I think a lot of that has to do with speed in general and how we perceive time, like how do we use time. And this has an influence on space, right? So how do we plan cities? Like how do we want to get from one place to the other? Like the machines that we want to use to get from here to there. So yeah, I think it's an important topic. Yeah.
Yeah. And you mentioned time. So, what tips and strategies can you offer in terms of time management? How do you maintain a balance between your professional and personal time?
I don't.
It's usually a question I ask later, but now that you've sort of hinted at it and knowing that you've got so many interests, and not just, in your philosophical pursuits, Zen Buddhism, photography, you also play samba, and
yes.
You're doing your PhD, and you're doing this project in Brasilandia.
Yes. Yeah, it's a bit difficult to manage everything and also manage family relationships and all of this stuff. I think that's also something that we need to put time on. Friends, all types of relationships. Right? Yeah, I think it's not easy. I think meditation is a big tool for me. Not only, sitting down meditation. I've been a bit bad lately on sitting down for meditation, but just watching a little bit my thoughts. I think it's really important. And there's a professor from mine on Buddhism that she says, when I asked her what was meditation, right? I was studying that for a while and I was confused. Like, what is meditation? Like, why is it? What is the difference between all the meditations that exist? Like, is it looking at a figure of meditation? And she said, like, a meditation to be a meditation, necessarily the object of observation are your thoughts. Mm-hmm. At least for Zen. I don't know for other branches or schools of Buddhism, but for Zen, meditating necessarily means that you're observing your thoughts. And that can also mean that, and that's also a bit of the Zen philosophy, that you sit down to train for standing up. So you sit down at meditation to train for meditating when you're not sitting down. So ideally, you become a very good standing up meditator after a while.
Interesting. Okay.
And that doesn't mean that if I don't meditate that I'm a good standing up meditator. I've just been lazy on meditation, to be honest. But I think observing my own thoughts is important. And also Zen doesn't have a differentiation between mind and body. They are the same. So observing my body is also very important to me. And it can get a bit overwhelming, right? Because sometimes like you are in an anxiety moment and you start observing your body and the body is giving signals and just gets overwhelming and it can be bad. But I think it's a nice hint to see like, oh, probably now I'm not feeling like continuing to be productive anymore today and just want to change a bit the task that I'm doing, this kind of stuff. So in general, I just try to observe myself and see if I can continue doing what I'm doing. And also with time is the same. So just seeing if it's the moment to continue in that deep thought for a lot of time, or if I need to just stop and do something else, just play some samba and do some other activities. I think the other activities are very important for me, at least to do a good job at the research, to have focus on the research, also have some escape routes is really important for me.
I guess, meditation has also been a very important part that I'm trying to adopt much more nowadays, because I find, like you said, it is about observing your thoughts.
Yeah.
I think being able to observe them non-judgmentally and using your breath as an anchor for that to be able to come back to the present or just being in the present. And I think that's where stand-up meditation, new term for me. I've only ever heard of stand-up comedy, but stand-up meditation, very, very nice use of the word. I've learned walking meditation before, and it's really a kind of exercise where you have to really feel yourself into the present as you feel your feet touch the ground. In fact, before we recorded this, we were talking about it actually. So quite funny that it's coming up now, but I guess that's the nature of it. And yeah, in a way, it tries to center you. How you're advising we go about our lives is to definitely focus on that balance, to anchor ourselves every now and then. Because if we don't, we lose sight of the research, the professional work that we want to do to change the world.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think recently I also asked that question to a meditation professor, like about the balance between. So Buddhism has this very important philosophy of enlightenment that can be a little bit different than some other religions and some other approaches. So for Zen, especially, there's not much of a worry about reaching an individual enlightenment. So you're not trained to reach nirvana and just stay there enjoying that peaceful situation. But mostly what Zen talks about is about collective enlightenment, kind of. And that means what other spiritual and religious practices have a lot is also the service, right? So being dedicated to something that you help other people and you assist and you're there for other people to also reach that place of enlightenment, let's say. And then I asked this professor about this balance, right? Because I feel that in work right now, like working with researching about nature and natural processes, for me, that's a very spiritual practice of service. So I'm kind of understanding how nature works, interacting with people. For me, that's serving the world, let's say.
And coming back to Spinoza as well.
Exactly.
We're really coming full circle.
Exactly. That's it. And then how do you find a balance when you see so much meaning on what you do? So that's kind of dangerous. And then I asked this professor, like, I struggle to have sitting down time of meditation because I feel that I need to be there for people. I need to do research. I need to, I am in a very privileged position that I want to use my time to kind of make good for society. So how do I sleep? Like, how do I sit down? Like, I feel that 5 minutes of sitting down is 5 less minutes that I'm reading a nice philosopher that could help me write a better paper that, would touch upon the matters that society needs a bit deeper. And he said, it's this balance you have to find out. Like, this is important. And in Zen is the same. Like, you're not serving all the time. You're not putting your hands out all the time. You have to also be able to sit down with your thoughts, because that's also a way that you find to see if you're in the right track. Because sometimes we also can do very bad thinking that we're doing good, right?
Yeah.
And it's very easy that we're out there, like, participating in the market, in the society, thinking that we're doing great things, but we didn't took enough time to just look at ourselves and like, is it really that, And I think meditation helps a bit, but also the environment that we are also helps a lot. Having opinions and critiques from other people, I think it's also a nice way for us to see where we're heading, like if the work that we're doing makes sense and this kind of stuff. So
just self-reflection in general, I guess, for those who shy away from meditation or, the word or the practice itself, just self-reflection would be sufficient.
That's it. Yeah. In the beginning of my Buddhist practice, I was really coming from an atheist background, right? I was really uncomfortable on like meditating, looking at shrines or looking at figures. I didn't like that. And then it was really interesting. This first Buddhist retreat that I did in the London Buddhist Center back in 2014 or 15, that the monk said like, if you don't believe in this, you can just look at this shrine as nature. So they actually brought some sticks from outside, like some leaves and some stones, and also put in the shrine. So that you could also just see it as nature in general. So if for you this connection is not straightforward, and if you're not comfortable with the connection between Buddhism or whatever with your natural environment, because nature, I think everybody has some connection with that, right? You can also call it nature, and that's more than good.
A very interesting way and practical way of looking at it.
Right.
And again, coming back to Spinoza. So
exactly.
I definitely have to go and read the Ethics.
It's
very,
nice.
very intriguing now that we've spoken about it for quite some time.
Yeah. Then you let me know, then we discuss about it.
Definitely.
Yes.
What is your favorite childhood memory?
I think what were the moments that I was with myself, working with tools in general. So my grandfather, he passed away some years ago. I didn't have much contact with him. So I visited him here and there, like he lived in another city. But he was a woodworker. And then I remember at some point that it's just a very child thing to do. And I said to him, like, Grandpa, when you pass away, can I have your tools?
No.
And he said, yeah, of course, you can have my tools. I would give you. And after a while, that eventually happened. And I actually got the tools. And I mean, it was a way for him to keep on living, right? I think that's a bit the concept of karma in Buddhism, like how the stuff that we do kind of still have a wave of consequence through eternity, in a sense. So he's still there in the tools. And I was like playing around with those tools. And I think I learned a lot about like materials and like creating stuff. So doing technology, right? Like creating artifacts. Yep. So for me, that was really nice. And I think that was a bit the moment. I mean, I also have a little bit of a bias there because my mother, she's a civil engineer. And so my mother would look at me working with those tools and she was like, oh, you are an engineer, right? I don't know if that created a bias, but indeed, I identify a lot with the profession. And I think it was a bit meant to be after that, looking at those things, like manipulating those tools. And then, just following the profession towards creation of artifacts. Like in the end, we're just creating artifacts, right? If it's a public building, if it's an intervention, it's still an artifact. So I think that's a nice memory that I have, just being in the garage of my family house, using the tools on a Sunday without having to worry about anything. It was a nice moment in life. Yeah.
No, fascinating. And so fast forward, now where you're at in your career, what was one of the most challenging situations that you have ever faced in your career to date, and how did you overcome it?
Challenging situations. I think in academia in general, I think we have to deal with a bit of an ego play, no? And I think for me, a challenging situation that was a bit recent was also like having to deal with who owns each idea that you're going to use, like. And I had a bit of a bad experience with that. But in the end, I think it was really important to have people around to discuss about the thing. I hope I don't have to go through those moments so much, but I think they will happen a lot. And I will have to be able to deal with this. So tensions of like authorship for us in academia, I think they're really big. Tensions between like ownership of ideas and this kind of stuff. But I think having good supervisors that we could discuss, me and you, for example, me and João, for example, me and Max, like we could talk about it. And it's nice to get the experience of people that have more experience on those things. And then it was possible to go through it. But it took me a couple of nights of sleep, I would say. But I think we went through it.
Yeah. Do you think ideas should have ownership, or is it more about who acts on those ideas in the end?
That's a very good question. I think there is a threshold there that I still have to learn a little bit more about that threshold, and I'm not secure about it. I would say that ideas don't have ownership, but I think there's also an ethics code involved that ideally is backed up by the university with ethic codes of conduct. Like, for example, deciding authorships, simply as that. Who is a co-author and who isn't?
Yeah.
So there, for example, ETH has guidelines on that, but it's not always clear as well, no? It's not always black and white.
It's usually a gray zone, yeah.
There are some gray zones and you cannot make rules for all cases, right? So I think there is some ethics involved, although I would say that in a utopic world, we just produce whatever and the ideas are out there. I don't know. What's your opinion on that? Like, how do you see it?
I mean, from my end, we all feel a sense of ownership towards the ideas, but I mean, ideas are nothing unless they're acted upon. You can have the most fascinating ideas, but if you don't have the means to stick with them and to transform them into tangibles, into real world impacts, then they're just going to be ideas. Yeah. So whatever looks good on paper doesn't necessarily look good in practice if you don't implement it well. So
exactly. And if you don't act upon, you're just hoarding the idea, and then the idea is not going to continue.
To me, it has no value because in the end, you hoard an idea. Yeah, great. It sits in a box, and so it's I guess tricky slope, but I try to take it as a philosophy in my own approaches as well.
Yeah.
You have an idea. If you don't act upon it, then it has no value. And so I try to share my ideas in hopes that others act upon it.
Yeah.
Whether I get something back or not, I think in the end, you have to be internally happy that even if you didn't get the benefit materially, that someone acted upon your idea and made the world a better place.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is nice to see, right? It's ideally you also feel happy about that happening.
To use the pun, yes, ideally.
Ideally, yes.
So what advice can you offer to young engineers, young architects, young planners starting out?
I would say read Marx. Yeah, I think that's a good thing to do, actually. I think
not Spinoza?
Spinoza, yes, as well. I think Spinoza is a bit far in terms of practicality for today.
Okay.
But I think Marx and the contemporary thinkers that kind of expand and bring Marx's ideas into today's struggles are very relevant. I would say David Harvey and Kohei Saito right now. But not only within Marx, but I think philosophy in general, I think it's really important that engineers have it. I regret a bit the fact that engineering schools don't have so much philosophy courses in Brazil. I don't know how is it in Europe in general.
I think it's similar.
It's similar, right?
Yeah.
There's one university in Brazil that I know that has a philosophy course during the bachelor's for engineers. But that's not something common. And I think it's really important because a lot of the things that we do and a lot of the ways that we see the world, they are based on those philosophers, right? A PhD is a philosophy thing.
A doctor of philosophy. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think it's important to read a bit of philosophy. And I'm not amazing on that. I would love to read more and know more and have more support on understanding more philosophy. Yeah, I know a little bit. And the things that I know, I enjoy a lot. And I see a lot of meaning on reading on those stuff. So I would say that people need to take more time on reading philosophy in general.
Yeah. Book recommendation? Best place to start for someone who's new to it?
I would suggest Kohei Saito's, I think. Slow down from Kohei Saito's because although it's a very new book, I think it ties back to lots of other important books and cites back some of these other thinkers that even have to do with urban planning as well. Like I think Saito also mentions a bit Harvey on this book. So I think that could be a nice reading that is very associated to today's things that we're going through. And I think that's a nice one to go, I would say. Yeah.
Okay. Slow down.
Slow down, yes.
No, interesting. And I guess it's really underpinned a lot of your experiences and a lot of what we've discussed today.
Yeah, I think so too.
Definitely.
I think so too.
And so what would you like to be remembered for?
Yeah, that's a bit of a tricky question. I think I have two sides on that question, to be honest, that I don't come to agreement within myself. I think there's, of course, the side of me as a young researcher that I need to appear out there and I need to have enough of a good curriculum to have the positions and enter the positions I want in the future as a postdoc and hopefully as a professor as well, which is where I want to get to. So, of course, I want to be remembered by very good research. So research of very good quality that really acts upon the social struggles that we live and be remembered as someone that did a work that's important on that area. But also I feel a bit divided because ideally I also want to be remembered by simple stuff. I think I also want to be remembered by someone that's present to the people I love and that's caring, that's loving and that's there when people need, that don't shy away from like dealing with problems and things. So yeah, this is a bit of a therapy motive for me, seeing like where do I want to be for people? How much time do I want to put my efforts on? So if I want to put more of my efforts into my career, that would be on the one side of being remembered for. Or if I want to put more effort on my relationships and my friends and my hobbies and other stuff that also makes Lucas exist and not only Lucas' career, let's say. But yeah, it's not a simple answer for me. So I'm still learning a lot on that process.
And I guess in discussing and preparing for this episode, we had yet another fun point of contention, which is the whole philosophy around Zen Buddhism as well.
Yeah, for sure. Zen for me, like it's also something that I have been studying a lot and I have been practicing a lot lately. which is actually fun. I don't know if you know, but in Buddhism, like you, when you get the precepts, the Buddhist precepts, so you have a set of rules, commandments, I don't know, that you kind of live your life along those lines, let's say. And you sew your own clothes. So you sew like a little
and you sew your own clothing.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a little summarized monk cloth. So it's just that little square that goes in front of the monks. It's called rakusu in the Japanese Buddhism, which is Zen. Zen is the Japanese Buddhism. And you also get a name. You get a name, a Buddhist name. And my name, I don't know if I even know how to pronounce it properly, is Ryusui, which means the flow of water. That's my Buddhist name. The monk that gave me the precepts, she gave me that name. And the name in Buddhism has to do with maybe something that you kind of are, that you show to people, or something that you should work on. I think in my case, it was something that I need to work on. So let me look more into flowing more like water, not just, just do the things I want the way I want, but let things kind of go towards the direction that they kind of need to go a little bit. And for me, it's also quite nice to having had that name given to me some years ago, and I'll be working in a water institute and like with work related to water, and also using the water paths and the water flows and runoff into my research as well. So it's pretty cool to have that as well.
To quote a famous martial artist, actor, polymath, call it that, Bruce Lee, be like water, my friend.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's Bruce Lee, but that's also, what is it? Is it Heraclitus? I don't know. It's also an old thing.
There's many quotes around water. And I guess the power of water to create, to flow around, to navigate life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Buddhism has this differentiation between, and I think this is a big topic on like individual aspects and collective aspects of your life, no? And I think there was this interesting episode also in one of the moments within the temple that I used to go in São Paulo, and in the community that I used to go in São Paulo. This professor told about the story of like, there was one of the practitioners of the students that once just brought a photograph of the professor there from the community and just hanged on the wall. And this professor was mad because like this is not the way that Zen tries to picture things. So ideally you don't preach or you don't think about so much on figures, although of course Buddhism, other religions as well have some images that you can anchor to, like some figure, like historical figures, and also like some
deities.
Exactly, yeah. So this kind of stuff. But ideally you don't go to the direction of the icon, just putting your faith in an icon or in an image or in a personality. But ideally, you understand what that thing represents and what are the things that you learn from that person or that little story, and on the teachings themselves. So there is not much of I want to be remembered as a Zen professor, but how much of the teachings can I make go through and echo in life, in humanity, after I pass away, kind of thing, I think with science is a bit going towards that direction as well, no? So I think before we had much more of those geniuses figures. If you go beside ETH, there's that huge wall in the main building with all the big figures. And in that same wall, there's also like the behaviors, approaches that you can have, like meditation, blah, blah, blah. There's many interesting words there as well. I think science is going more to the direction of like what are the processes, the words, the things that you strive for, than to the figures that get that thing done, There's this scientific communication physicist in Brazil that I really enjoy her work. And one person asked her, like, do you want to win the Nobel Prize? And she said, like, yeah, I mean, that's not even a thought. The Nobel Prize is not something that nowadays, at least, is not so much of an effort of a genius that kind of did a breakthrough or something, but much more like a consequence of so much giants that came before you and of the community of other scientists' work. And eventually this is going to fall in somebody's lap. Of course, that person or that group will be doing an amazing job, of course, but I think science is now going more to that direction of like what is the community or the scientific method is doing, than like who are the owners of the truth, like who are the geniuses, Yeah. And I think as scientists, I sometimes tend to fall a little bit on this character a little bit, like just being dedicated to research a lot. Like sometimes I think we feel like, we need to I talk about this to my therapist, so like that kind of struggle of, look, I have the best infrastructure possible. I have all the means possible. I have to be a genius. Like there's no way out. I have to do that. Like that's the least I can do, kind of,
The felt pressure.
Exactly. And I think we kind of fall a little bit on this internal fallacy, and I actively have to deal with that, to kind of set it aside and say like, no, you don't have to be there. Like you don't have to do everything. You're not that as well. Like you're not even that. And just, support your community, just be there for people and more as a group than as a scientist in itself, kind of, But it's not easy.
Such a deep dive, but so interesting to see you tackle that question from different angles. And I guess we also get to see a lot of the internal conflict that I'm sure is also in many of our minds as well.
I think so too,
yeah. But no, thanks for sharing. And I think it's important to just, as you said, take a moment to reflect frequently.
Yeah.
And to ask ourselves whether it matters, what matters most, and in a way, see our path from there.
Yeah, exactly, yes.
So where can people find you if they want to get in touch?
So there's my website, lucasgobatti, gobatti.com, they can enter. And that website connects to everything else. So my Eawag page and also my other social media as well. So Instagram, I'm also there, a bit more active there than in other social media. But yeah, website, the centralization of all of that.
I love it. And we'll definitely put a link to that. You can also find all your book lists, recommendations there.
The shelf is there.
I have to go and look at that shelf.
Yeah, and I have to update it as well.
No, definitely. But I might steal that idea from you. I do like the idea of sharing book recommendations.
I think it's really cool.
Yeah, and I too think that websites serve as a good centralization hub. But we'll put that in Instagram in the show notes, and along with a lot of other information about things we discussed today. Lucas, really appreciate your time. Thank you so very much for coming on to the show. And like I do with every guest on the show, I always give my guests the final words. So one last message for the listeners to take away from today.
I think that I will also echo another message that I got when I was younger as well. I remember that I met this neighbor in my mother's building, and I was coming back from school, and he said, do as much as you can, like do as much things as you can. Get involved into sports, travel, read a lot, do the courses that you can do. Because I think eventually the paths that you will better serve society, that you will better serve humanity will pop out for you. So I would say do a range of nice different things, occupy your time with interesting and diverse activities, that the paths will clarify, I would say. Well, yeah, thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure to talk to you, Peter.
Thank you very much. Obrigado.
De nada.
And that wraps up our deep, eye-opening and wide-ranging episode with Lucas Gobatti. For more resources on different philosophers, some insights on Sao Paulo and its culture, or just a few good tips on meditation and self-reflection, check out the show notes for more information over at petermbach.com/podcast. And as always, thank you listeners for tuning into this episode and for your feedback and support. If you are enjoying this show, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this podcast with your family, friends, colleagues, and even fellow students. Subscribe or follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, or other podcast channels, or follow the LinkedIn group to stay up to date with the latest releases. If you're curious about me or my work in general, you can also check out my website or social media. Head to petermbach.com, my YouTube channel, Peter Marcus Bach, that's Marcus with a C, or follow me on X at Peter M. Bach or Instagram at petermbach87. Feel free to reach out to me with any feedback or guest suggestions so that I can keep improving this show. The podcast intro and outro song is called Starsky by Alex Karen. Stay tuned for our next episode and next guest to hear how they are tackling the grand challenges.